Good morning, church. Today we're going to unpack a story that will be familiar to many of you who have been reading the Bible for some time now. It's also going to be new to some of you, which is exciting because it's a really cool story. I'm talking about the story of Joseph, son of Jacob, and his adventures in Egypt. Now, we looked at the life of Jacob last week, along with his interactions with his Aramean father-in-law. I mentioned in that message that Jacob was the father of 12 sons through 4 different women. The historical record tells us that polygamy was pretty normal in the nomadic patriarchal societies of the time. In fact, it only became prohibited in codified form, basically written down, in the period following the return of the Jewish nation from the exiles, somewhere around 538 BC. Now, 2 of those women who birthed sons by Jacob were his wives. The other 2 were the maidservants of his wives. And as we saw last week, it was also a legally accepted practice to produce heirs through maidservants of a man's wife. Now, the Bible tells us that Jacob's favorite wife was Rachel, an Aramean woman who was the daughter of Laban, the man who gave him all the trouble we talked about last week. A few weeks ago, I ran into an individual who claimed that the genetic bloodline of Jesus Christ was pure Hebrew from end to end. And I kind of went, even Hebrew isn't pure Hebrew. He got a little uncomfortable when I told him, that's actually white supremacist thinking. Jesus would have carried genetic markers from Aramaean, Moabite, Canaanite, possibly even other people groups. He was a man of many nations. But Rachel gave birth to 2 sons, the first of whom was Joseph. And he's the guy we want to zoom in on this morning. We pick up our story in Genesis chapter 37, verse 3, and here's what it says. It says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him." Now, a couple things here. We got to pause, and they need to be mentioned. First, the names Israel and Jacob are interchangeable. They both refer to the same person. Back in Genesis 32:28, Jacob encountered what scholars call a theophany. A theophany is God appearing in human form. At that time, God told Jacob he would no longer be known by his former name of Jacob. He was giving him a new name, Israel, meaning struggles with God. Another thing worth noting is that some translations say that Israel gave Joseph a coat of many colors. Others simply said an ornate robe. The truth is, we don't know what the heck the Hebrew word here actually means. We're just guessing. Could be a size large. I don't know. But the narrative tells us that Joseph's 11 brothers were seriously jealous of him. Part of it was this robe. Part of it was some dreams that Joseph had. But they were so jealous of him that they met him at a place called Dothan, which is now in the West Bank. And they sold him as a slave for 20 shekels of silver to some Midianite traders. Now, the Midianites were an Arabic people. They lived just east of the Gulf of Aqaba on the Arabian Peninsula. There was a known frankincense trade route that came out of Arabia, went up over the Gulf, passed through the West Bank on the way to Egypt. There's actually a reference to it in one of the very few papyrus records we have from the Second Intermediate Period of Egypt. I mentioned that time frame last week as the most probable period for this story, sometime after the year 1666 BC when chariots first appeared in Egypt. But it's really worth noting that there is lots of Second Intermediate Period Egypt in the story of Joseph. Joseph's brothers took his special robe, dipped it in goat blood, and carried it back to Israel/Jacob, where they made the claim that they'd found it in the desert. Therefore, Joseph must have been killed by some wild animal. The Midianites, in the meantime, carried Joseph to Egypt, where they sold him to a man by the name of Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. The Midianites were basically acting as retailers, buying goods at wholesale, reselling them for a profit. Only Joseph was the goods. Now, the Bible tells us that Joseph was a talented young man, and he soon rose to a prominent position in Potiphar's house. We read in Genesis 39, verse 4, that Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. That is, as we later learn, until Potiphar's rather lustful wife set sights on him. And Joseph turned her down. She got her nose out of joint. She told her husband a fabricated story about Joseph coming on to her. Bada bing, bada boom, Joseph found himself in jail. Okay? That's where he met two fellow cellmates. One, the former chief cupbearer to Pharaoh, and the other, the former chief baker for Pharaoh. Now here's where it gets interesting. Both of these guys had a dream on the same night. The chief cupbearer had a dream about grapes being squeezed into Pharaoh's cup. The chief baker had a dream about carrying baskets of bread on his head and birds eating out of them. Now, this is where archaeology can inform us about what's going on here. The ancient Egyptians put a tremendous amount of weight on dreams and dream interpretation. In fact, they had a book called the Book of Dreams that was used as a manual for interpreting the meaning of dreams. We have a piece of it in our possession. It's known as the Chester Beatty Papyrus 3. In ancient Egypt, you didn't go to someone and ask them what they thought a dream you had meant. You went to the reference manual. And the Egyptians were really rigid about this. If the dream you had wasn't in the book, you didn't try guessing at it. The dream about grapes being squeezed into a cup is in this document. It's in Chester Beatty number 3. We've got this dream. It's a very bad dream. The Egyptian Book of Dreams was divided into two sections, bin, bad, and nefer, good. Grapes being squeezed into a cup is about as bad as you can get. If you had this dream, you were pretty much done for. Now, the chief baker's dream is not in Chester Beatty 3, but most of the nefer section about good dreams is missing. We don't have the complete manuscript. But here's the interesting thing about this story. Joseph gave the chief cupbearer an interpretation that ran counter to what was in the Egyptian Book of Dreams. That just wasn't done. You didn't go against the reference manual. When the chief cupbearer first approached Joseph and told him this dream, he was terrified. He'd had a really, really bad dream. But Joseph said, don't worry, this is going to be okay. And it turned out he was right. Three days later, Pharaoh restored the chief cupbearer to his former role, but he hanged the chief baker. Now, it would be really cool if we had all of Papyrus number 3, so we could see if Joseph's interpretation of the chief baker's dream also ran counter to the standard interpretation. But the point is, when Pharaoh later had a dream that wasn't in the Egyptian Book of Dreams, the chief cupbearer immediately remembered Joseph. He said, wait a minute, I know a guy. It's a classic line. I shared a cell with a guy in the joint. Pharaoh summoned Joseph, and he asked him if he could interpret his dream. In Genesis 41:16, it reads, I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Did you notice that other but God reference in there? Bible's full of them. Verse 17, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. Well, Joseph immediately offered an interpretation to Pharaoh. He told them the dream was a warning that Egypt was about to experience 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Therefore, the wisest course of action would be to appoint someone to oversee keeping some of the harvest in reserve to prepare for this event. Pharaoh looked around his court at all these guys who were unable to interpret his dream, and then he turned to Joseph and said, I pick you. Now, Genesis 42 is a fascinating verse. Here's what it says. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger, and he put it on Joseph's finger. Then he dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Now, I've already mentioned that this narrative likely comes to us from what is known as the second intermediate period of Egyptian history, Dynasty 15. It's also known as the Hyksos era. It runs from about 1780 to about 1540 BC. The Hyksos were an Asiatic people who invaded Egypt, took control of the northern part of the country, the Nile Delta. Well, the written record from the period is really sparse. Basically, all we have is a total of 25 pages of text. We do have some statues and paintings. A few of them feature significant officials in the kingdom that Egyptologists refer to as viziers. They all have 3 things in common that are not featured in any other imagery of the time. They're all wearing signet rings. They're dressed in unique clothing, robes, that are different than any other, unlike that of worn by any other officials. And they all have a short gold chain around their neck. The 3 marks of a Hyksos vizier were a ring, fine robes, and a neck chain. Now, I'm not sure why Pharaoh is green here. It must be something he ate. But this guy on the right has the same uniform on that Joseph would have worn to work every day. Now, the Bible tells us that Joseph immediately set about putting this grain storage plan into effect. When the 7 years of famine finally came upon the land, Egypt was well prepared. Unfortunately, it was not a local event. Drought struck the entire Middle East. Over in the Levant, over in Palestine, Joseph's father and brothers were suffering. Jacob gathered his sons and said, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. Now, this was not a short trip. This is not like walking to West Lake. The trip from Canaan to Lower Egypt was over 300 kilometers. When Joseph's brothers eventually arrived in Egypt, guess who they ran into? Joseph, their brother. But they failed to recognize him. 13 years had passed since they'd sold him to the Midianites. His head was shaved. He was wearing the Egyptian male makeup that was typical for all high-ranking officials. He was in a position of vast influence. But Joseph recognized them. So he started leading them on. He accused them of being spies who had only traveled to Egypt to scope out the defenses. He demanded that they prove they weren't spies by leaving one of their brothers behind as a hostage in Egypt while the rest returned to Canaan with the grain they'd bought. The only proof he was willing to accept of their innocence would be if they returned with Benjamin, the brother they claimed was still at home with their father. So Joseph kept Simon as a hostage, and he sent the rest back to Canaan. But Genesis 42:25 and 26 read, Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left. When the brothers stopped on the journey home, they opened their sacks to get feed for their donkeys. Lo and behold, their silver was sitting in the mouth of their grain sacks. Not good. The Bible says their hearts sank and they turned to each other trembling and said, "What is this that God has done to us?" Uncertain of what to do, they continued on their journey to Canaan. When they arrived and told Jacob that not only had they found their silver in their grain sacks, but they needed to return with their younger brother Benjamin, Jacob refused. He said, "Joseph is no more, Simon is no more, now you want to take Benjamin." The problem is this was no short famine. Before long, Jacob and his sons had consumed all the grain they'd bought in Egypt. Again, they were facing starvation. So Jacob called his sons and instructed them to return to Egypt, taking along with them double the silver to make up for what had obviously mistakenly been put in their sacks. Only this time he let them take their younger brother Benjamin along with them. When they arrived in Egypt and told Joseph's steward that somehow the silver they bought the grain with last time had been put in their sacks, the steward acted like it was some kind of a miracle. He said, "Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver." Well, they were then invited over to Joseph's house for dinner, after which it was time for round 2 of the silver back in the sack saga. Once again, the brothers loaded up their donkeys with grain. Once again, Joseph ordered their silver to be put along with the grain in their sacks. Only this time, he had his servants put his silver cup in Benjamin's sack. Now, I cannot listen to this story without recalling an event that happened some time ago at a meeting we were holding at an Earl's in Regina with the vice president of the Alliance in Canada, along with a group of pretty influential First Nations Christian leaders. We were always bugging this vice president for wearing suits to First Nations meetings. We told him to buy some jeans, maybe a T-shirt, a Cree parka, which is what they call a jean jacket in the winter on the prairies. He wouldn't listen to us. So at this meeting, just before we got up to leave, he went to take a washroom break. That's when we loaded the pockets of his trench coat with cutlery from the Earls we were eating at. Then we called over the girl who had served our table, and we said, "You want to have some fun? When we get up to leave, stop that guy and confront him for stealing the restaurant cutlery." Her eyes just lit up. She was all in. 2 things resulted from that practical joke. The first, I saw some normally very dignified chiefs and bound counselors laugh till the tears ran down their faces. Secondly, we got the vice president of the Alliance to start wearing jeans to our meeting. But this event in the Bible was uncannily similar. It really was. After his brothers left, Joseph sent his servants to catch up with them. And when they did, they searched the grain bags, and they found the silver cup in Benjamin's bag. Joseph's servants dragged them back to Egypt, where they once again appeared before Joseph. And there's a curious comment made by the brothers in Genesis 44:16. after Joseph confronted them with the evidence of their theft. They said, God has uncovered your servant's guilt. Now, most biblical scholars agree that because these sons of Jacob were clearly innocent of stealing Joseph's silver cup, this is kind of an indirect confession of their culpability in selling Joseph into slavery. Chapter 45, verse 1 reads, Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants, and he cried out, Have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. Bible says his brothers were terrified, but he calmed them down and directed them to return to Canaan, bring Jacob back with them, their father, so he could settle them in the land of Goshen, where they could be safe from the famine that was devastating the land. Goshen is a fertile strip of land known as the Wadi Tumalit, that connects the Nile Delta to Lake Timsah. The name is no longer used in modern Egyptian geography, but no Egyptian has any doubt where Goshen was located. It's an exceptionally fertile strip of land to this very day. Before I wrap this up, I want to show you a curious mural from Tomb 3 of Numhotep II, who was another high official in Egypt. The tomb is located in Beni Hassan in Egypt. It depicts a group of people from the Palestine, Canaan area being led by two Egyptian guides into Egypt. Egyptologists have determined that from their clothing, their beards, their tools, their animals, that these are Asiatic people from the Canaan area. The bottom is an artist's reproduction. The top is the original. The bottom is an artist's reproduction of the images. Now, this mural dates from about 150 years before Joseph's time, but this would have been a very similar scene to the one the Egyptians would have witnessed as the sons of Jacob made their way into Goshen. The Bible tells us that in time Jacob passed away and went home to be with the Lord. His sons were terrified that he was really the only thing keeping Joseph from exacting revenge upon them. In Genesis 50, verse 18, we read, His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. Verses 19 and 20 then read, But Joseph said to them, Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. There it is again, that recurring thread that runs throughout the tapestry of the entire Bible. But God. Okay, so what's our take home here? It's actually really fairly straightforward. You know, the entire future of faith was hanging by a thread. I'm not sure if Joseph knew it at the time, but when he talked about this particular but God moment that resulted in the saving of many lives, he wasn't just talking about his brothers and their families. He was prophetically referring to all of humanity. One of those brothers kneeling before Joseph was Judah, the direct ancestor of Jesus Christ. You know, almost 3,700 years later, the existential threat to faith really hasn't diminished one bit. You may never have thought this before, but Christianity lives or dies with every generation. The torch was passed to us by the preceding generation. If we fail to forward it on to the next generation, then faith vanishes from this earth. But God is not going to let that happen. And that's why he called you into his kingdom. The story of Joseph isn't over, and you're one of the storytellers. This world, with all its temptations and distractions, still intends to harm us. but God intends it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. The only question is, are we up for the great adventure of keeping the truth alive until the Lord returns? Well, we're going to move into our response time now. This is where you can respond to anything God may have stirred in your heart this morning. Maybe you need to let God know that you're open to taking part in His great rescue mission, however He leads you. Our worship team is going to come up, lead us in song. As they do, our communion servers will be standing here at the front, distributing the bread that represents the body of Christ broken for us, the cup that represents the shed blood of Jesus Christ. Come, receive God's forgiveness. Lay hold of faith. Take the elements back to your seat. Partake whenever you feel ready. If you would like someone to pray for you this morning, after you receive communion, our prayer team will be in the prayer room there. The door may be closed. Don't worry about it. Just open the door. Go right on in. Sit down. They'll be waiting there for you. Once everyone has received the communion elements, our hospitality ministries team will come around to receive the morning offering. You can give it the kiosk at the back. If you're online, you can use the donate button. But for now, let's worship God together.